Gary knows how to put on a conference. I'm very impressed, both as a speaker and as an attendee. He is just excellently organized in everything, perfect attention to detail. So thank you, Gary, for organizing BitBlockBoom. Today, I'm going to be preaching to the choir, I think, but hopefully I'll be reiterating and reinforcing some points that you already knew, but maybe you forgot to bring up with your no-coiner friends, or learning something new. I'm hoping that there's something for everyone. All right, so I think that one of the biggest misconceptions, and one that I had when I first heard about Bitcoin, was that Bitcoin was just a payment system. And it's a very easy misconception to have because if you just go read the white paper, you walk away from it just thinking, well, all right, and this allows me to transfer value on the internet without using a trusted third party, a financial institution. And the white paper doesn't even say anything about Bitcoin's monetary policy. It doesn't mention the 21 million Bitcoin cap. Doesn't explain how the coins, with the halving and all of this scarcity. So it's been very easy for folks to overlook the fact that Bitcoin inherently, just de facto, as what it is, as how it exists in the world, is not just a payments technology. It is a savings technology as well. So if you think about, I don't know if you've taken any financial accounting classes, but I think you should if you have not. If you are receiving cash and then you hold it on your balance sheet, that's a cash inflow. And then if you send your cash out, that's a cash outflow. The time while it's on your balance sheet, it's savings. And in economics, economists talk about savings. And savings is distinct from investment. Investment is when you give someone else your money and you expect them to put it to work by paying employees, by paying suppliers, to generate sales and turn a profit. Savings is when you just hold cash on your balance sheet. And when you're saving, what you're doing is that you're deferring the decision of whether to invest or consume and what to consume or what to invest in. And so savings is actually a crucial component of the economic process for people to be able to allocate their capital across time without being pushed into making a rash investment or a compulsive consumption decision. Now, we don't really think about savings a lot in our fiat world because fiat currencies are specifically designed to disincentivize you from savings. They deliberately inflate the supply of dollars or whatever you're using, euros, Japanese yen, to try to push you to consume or invest as quickly as possible. And so we see people, whenever they receive their paycheck, their first thing to think about is, all right, how much do I put in the stock market? How much do I put into a CD, lend it to the bank for 2%? Or how do I quickly get it out the door to go pay for my new car, finance a new car, etc. So we're not used to thinking about just accumulating cash on our balance sheet and being very prudent about the way that we use our money. So there's a number of different savings technologies like gold, the dollar, Bitcoin. Today I'm going to make the argument for why Bitcoin is the best savings technology. First of all, we can talk about the scarcity of it. 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis is the hard-coded maximum amount of Satoshis that will exist. For those of you that don't know, there's 100 million Satoshis in one Bitcoin. So it's a highly divisible form of savings, and 21 million Bitcoin. Now, there's been quite a few Bitcoin that have gotten lost. People, putting it on a hard drive back when it had no value in 2010, and then they throw the hard drive in the landfill. And sad stories, but now people estimate there's about 3 to 4 million Bitcoin that have been lost. So take that into account when you think about Bitcoin scarcity. Now the counter-argument, as we saw that Tone did a great job of going through all the different altcoins that exist. So people will say, well, how can Bitcoin be scarce when you can just copy-paste the Bitcoin code and create your own altcoin? So they argue that crypto is not scarce. Thousands of altcoins. Some of them are trying to innovate, of course, but in any case, they argue that it's inflationary. The metaphor I would draw would be in the art world, where it's also true that there's an abundance of artwork on your refrigerator from your children or your niece or nephew, and yet we don't see those pieces of art get auctioned off at Christie's for hundreds of millions of dollars. But there are other pieces of art that do. So clearly we need to think more deeply about what drives value in the art market rather than generalizing to whether art is scarce or abundant. And I would argue that this applies to Bitcoin as well, where if we're thinking about the scarcity of Bitcoin, we need to specifically talk about Bitcoin and what differentiates it from the other cryptos. So I think that there's two main sources of differentiation. There's the fundamental adoption drivers, and then there's the reflexive feedback loops. And the fundamentals are really talking about where the rubber meets the road and the specific underlying properties of Bitcoin as a monetary system. Whereas the reflexive feedback loops are more about incidental history of Bitcoin, the social layer of Bitcoin, and how that has evolved. I think both are equally important, but let's start with the fundamental adoption drivers. Bitcoin is permissionless, so if you want to be sending and receiving Bitcoin payments, you don't need to sign up for a KYC AML account on an exchange. What you can do is you can spin up a BTC Pay server merchant application with a self-hosted WordPress, and you can be selling goods and services on the internet. You can even put it on Tor, and I think the greatest historical example of how permissionless Bitcoin is the Silk Road, right? Ross Ulbricht or whoever Dread Pirate Roberts was able to spin up a Tor hidden service and be able to sell or provide a marketplace for people who wanted to sell whatever they want. Now, ultimately, he did get caught, but he actually, from what we know, did not get caught because of Bitcoin or because of the permissionless nature of Bitcoin. He got caught because the U.S. Postal Service is not permissionless. So watch out for that. But if you're selling digital goods or services, obviously you can. The world is your oyster when it comes to accepting payments. And Tone touched on this as well. Like Netflix sells digital goods of streaming video. There's no reason why they couldn't offer that anywhere in the world that has internet access. And then you can also, be using Bitcoin on your phone. That's a screenshot of the Lightning app. So again, you can just download the app, install it. You can be accepting payments peer-to-peer, sending them without having to provide your driver's license or anything like that. So that's the first fundamental adoption driver for Bitcoin that I wanted to point out. Now, you could argue that altcoins are also benefit from this same level of permissionlessness, and to an extent, I do agree that they've been able to copy paste this feature, but there are other parts of it. Now, seizure resistance is a little more complicated. Of trying to think why is it that someone cannot just take your Bitcoin? And so there's the question of how to secure your private keys. A lot of people are relying on Coinbase and custodying with Coinbase for their Bitcoin. Now, the problem with that is that is not seizure resistant. It's no more seizure resistant than your bank account. The government can subpoena Coinbase, can freeze your Coinbase account, and seize your Bitcoin. On the other hand, if you decide to self-custody, you create an excellent multi-sig solution like Justin Moon was talking about earlier today, whether it's with Unchained Capital or Casa or lots of other options, including the cold card from Rodolfo Novak, so go check that out. Here we have a picture of the Open Dime, which is specifically shaped to be seizure resistant in the context of a prison wallet. So that's very impressive engineering on his part. Now, there's also the crypto steel here that allows you to be seizure resistant from a fire, for example. So it's not necessarily just the government. It could also be the elements of nature that are trying to seize your Bitcoin from you. So this is a huge advantage that Bitcoin has, and you can even take it so far as to just memorizing a seed so that you have a brain wallet, in which case you can just cross a national border, and no matter how thoroughly they search you, they would not be able to know that in your mind there are Bitcoin. So it's another fundamental adoption driver for Bitcoin being seizure resistant. Now, it's important to point out that I used the word, and the community generally uses the word resistant. We're not saying it's seizure proof, right? There's always opportunities for the government or for a thief or for you to accidentally lose your keys. The question is, how much does it cost? So by increasing the cost of seizing Bitcoin, making it more resistant to seizure than the alternatives, whether it's physical gold bars or physical cash or a bank account, that's what drives Bitcoin's differentiating advantage there. Same thing with censorship resistant. I'm not going to argue that Bitcoin is censorship proof. Although, in practice, we've seen very little to no censorship of Bitcoin transactions. The previous panel had discussed the issue of mining pools, and despite complaints about centralization of mining pools, they haven't really abused that centralization to enable censorship of Bitcoin transactions. And even if they did, what would happen is that the transaction fees that someone attaches to a transaction would just increase until a miner gives up and includes it in a block. And the reason they give up is because it's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma of whoever includes that transaction first gets the transaction fee. Now, Bitcoin's transaction fees can go very high. We saw in December of 2017, the median transaction fee was $25 to $35 per transaction. And the reason that is that Bitcoin is such a liquid money at this point that even though there is a cost to transacting on-chain, the alternative would be for you to convert your Bitcoin into a different cryptocurrency, incur the transaction costs, the slippage involved in doing that conversion, and then sending it cheaply on-chain on a less secure chain. So what we've seen is that people are willing to pay very high transaction fees to use Bitcoin's network, and that tells us that Bitcoin's going to continue to be censorship resistant since we'll be able to send transactions without worrying about miners not including them in blocks. Now, so that again, this is a fundamental adoption driver that altcoins struggle to replicate because Bitcoin's transaction finality is much greater than theirs, and the censorship resistance at the level of including transactions and blocks is much greater than in altcoins. So for a number of different reasons, and it also applies to proof of stake as well. So for example, EOS, they have mechanisms for, they have institutionalized mechanisms for censoring transactions based on whether they like it or not. You know, they were talking about trying to ban gambling transactions. So there's no such thing going on in Bitcoin. Now, the last fundamental adoption driver is the sound monetary policy. And I thought Saifedean would talk about that this morning, but he had more urgent issues to address with regards to the farming situation, which I actually do agree with him. But my personal hobby horse is the Bitcoin sound monetary policy. And the huge advantage that Bitcoin has on this is the difficulty adjustment process. So when the value of Bitcoin is increasing in the marketplace, it's not the case that miners can just generate more Bitcoin to meet that additional demand. That is true of gold, where gold miners have to or are incentivized to go mine more gold because now they can justify a greater cost, and so they bring out more tons of gold from the ground. With Bitcoin, there's a difficulty adjustment every 2 weeks so that it sticks to that supply schedule. And that's what allows Bitcoin's scarcity to be a part of the network. Now, the part that's really important with monetary policy, because you'll have altcoins, they'll show you a similar graph, right? They'll say, oh, well, we have a sound money policy as well. Take a look at this. What differentiates Bitcoin is the credibility of that monetary policy and how a a cryptocurrency's monetary policy is rendered credible is by the decentralization, not of the mining pools or of the hash rate, but of the fully validating nodes. That is, people using the Bitcoin software itself to verify that when someone tells them that they're sending them 1 Bitcoin, that Bitcoin is in a valid Bitcoin transaction that gets included in a valid Bitcoin block and then buried behind 6 confirmations or whatever the rule of thumb they're using is. And you can only do that in a trustless manner if you are running a Bitcoin full node. Running a Bitcoin full node allows you to not only verify the payments that you're receiving, it also allows you to verify Bitcoin's global monetary policy. And if a block ever comes in that deviates that Bitcoin monetary policy, your node will automatically reject it, assuming there are no bugs. So cross your fingers. But so far, so good. We haven't had an inflation bug actually get exploited. So here's a diagram of the Bitcoin network. It's kind of visualized. And then you see at the top right and at the top of the page, there's all of this mining hash rate that's going into mining pools. And they are submitting their blocks to the Bitcoin network for validation. And so nodes are run by anyone, really. You can run a node on your laptop today or your desktop or your Raspberry Pi. What really matters, though, is when you're running a node that you use it to verify the transactions that you're receiving so that you don't have to trust a third-party block explorer or someone else's node. And exchanges obviously also run their nodes. Any major economic players run their full nodes so that they can be verifying their payments. And when an invalid block comes in that tries to create more Bitcoin, this happened recently. It was not a malicious or nefarious miner. It was just that they had a bug in their software that accidentally tried to create a little more Bitcoin. The whole network rejected that block as being invalid. And so that's what really shows you what enforces Bitcoin's monetary policy is this decentralized network of full nodes that has an open entry. So anyone can enter the Bitcoin network. You can spin up a node on Tor so that you have better privacy in that regard. And you can use your full node to broadcast your transactions to peers. And then they'll relay it to a miner, and it'll ultimately get included in a block. So that's what enforces Bitcoin's monetary policy, and it's often overlooked or denigrated by detractors of Bitcoin who will focus in on the centralization of mining pools or the centralization of software developers, for example. Because ultimately, what software you use to run your full node is up to you. You get to opt in to what Bitcoin implementation you want to use. You can write your own from scratch. You can use one of many that already exists. And the most prominent one is Bitcoin Core because it is kind of the historical descendant of Satoshi's code base. Currently, it has an excellent set of open source contributors who are really moving the Bitcoin network in terms of innovation and reliability. They're moving it forward. So that's on nodes. Now we're going to get into the reflexive feedback loops. So these are, I don't consider them to be fundamentals because they're basically just accidents of history. So first one is the first mover advantage, right, of Bitcoin's immaculate conception, as it's called, where Satoshi, when he first mined Bitcoin, he did not have a market price that existed for Bitcoin. Bitcoin was trading at $0 because nobody wanted it. And he expended resources, right? When he was mining, it's not like he had a pre-mine where he was instantly granted X number of Bitcoin. He actually did the SHA-256 squared proof of work for those blocks that earned him the Bitcoin. So he did expend resources to earn something that at the time was completely worthless. And so from that perspective, Bitcoin did not have any seigniorage, which means that there was no untoward revenue that was made out of thin air by someone just creating currency without actually doing the work required. So very few altcoins can claim that. And I think that it's actually impossible now to really launch an altcoin in the same way because there's so much attention on the space now. So whenever someone is creating a new altcoin, it immediately has market value to its detriment, I would argue. So the second aspect of this is the Lindy effect, which is that the longer something is around, the longer we can expect it to be around. Bitcoin's now at 10.5 years. So whenever someone on the street hears about Bitcoin crashing or Bitcoin hitting a record new high, they scratch their chin and think, wow, Bitcoin's still alive, huh? It's still doing its thing. So that's Bitcoin's Lindy effect in action. And it's much like in the advertising world where someone doesn't buy a product because it's the first time that they saw an ad for that product. They buy it maybe on the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 12th time, 20th time, where the advertising has become ingrained in their brain and they're fully brainwashed. And so that's what Bitcoin is doing. And I think the most effective form of advertising for Bitcoin has been Michael Goldstein's advanced mimetic warfare, which has truly reinforced the cult-like echo chamber on Bitcoin Twitter so that everyone is just stacking sats. And that credit goes to Matt O'Donnell.